Hello everyone, tonight we explore the story of Alexander the Great, a man who carved his empire with rivers of blood, who stood undefeated on battlefields where entire nations crumbled before his fury. From the smoking ruins of Thebes to the burning palaces of Persia, his sword was both justice and terror. His enemies called him a beast, his soldiers called him a god, yet in the shadows he feared betrayal from those closest to him. He marched across deserts that swallowed armies, stormed walls thought unbreakable, and dragged kings in chains to their knees. His justice was merciless, his ambition limitless, and his life a storm of glory and paranoia. In the end, he conquered the world, but could not conquer death. In the northern Greek city of Pella, a child was born in 356 BC under omens so powerful that priests whispered he was destined for conquest. His father, King Philip II of Macedon, was a brilliant but ruthless warrior king, feared for his ambition and iron will. His mother, Olympias, was equally formidable, a woman consumed with mystical rites and visions of destiny, fiercely protective yet dangerous in her passions. The boy's birth was said to coincide with the burning of the Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the world, a sign that the gods themselves had chosen him. From the moment Alexander opened his eyes, he was surrounded not by tenderness, but by the suffocating weight of power and prophecy. Childhood in the royal palace was not gentle. Though he lived amidst gold, marble halls and servants at his call, he was constantly tested by the expectations of a warrior dynasty. His father was away on campaigns, shaping Macedonia into a rising military machine, while his mother instilled in him an unshakable belief in divine bloodlines. Rumors spread that Alexander was not the son of Philip at all, but a descendant of Zeus, a claim Olympias fiercely encouraged. Even as a child, he was made to feel both chosen and isolated, a prince with no ordinary childhood, bearing the seeds of a godlike destiny. The world around young Alexander was brutal and unforgiving. Macedonia was no serene kingdom but a land carved by war, betrayal and shifting alliances. Murderous court intrigues were whispered in palace corridors, assassins waited in shadows, and every royal feast was a theatre of ambition and deceit. In this environment, Alexander learned quickly never to trust fully, to watch every glance and gesture. His earliest playmates were not just children, but the sons of noblemen who might one day become rivals or enemies. Every game of wrestling, every race on horseback, as a rehearsal for survival in a kingdom that devoured the weak. Though surrounded by suspicion, Alexander's nature shone early with fire and brilliance. He loved the stories of Homer, listened with awe to the legends of Achilles, and dreamed not of mere survival, but of eternal glory. Unlike other children, he was fearless, reckless even, eager to test himself against dangers. When others sought safety, Alexander sought challenge, whether in hunting wild beasts or mastering a horse that none could tame. His determination to stand apart from the crowd was relentless, his pride already that of a king in waiting. What shaped him most was not comfort, but the constant demand to prove he was worthy of greatness. Yet beneath this strength lay the marks of fear and longing. His father's conquests often kept him away, and Philip's harshness when present cast a long shadow over the boy. Olympias filled the void with her fierce devotion, but also her ambition, whispering in his ear that he was destined for power greater than his father's. Torn between admiration and resentment, Alexander grew with a heart both hardened and restless. In the silence of palace nights, he wondered whether he would ever be more than his father's heir, or whether he would eclipse him, as his mother foretold. Thus began the making of a conqueror whose earliest battles were not with armies, but with blood, destiny, and the crushing weight of expectation. The boy's childhood was marked by constant reminders that he was not like others. When most children learned to play, he was pushed into hunting lions, mastering weapons, and proving courage before seasoned warriors. His father demanded nothing less than strength, but Olympias demanded faith in divine destiny. She told him that Zeus himself was his true father, and Alexander clung to this belief with fierce pride. Every scar from a hunt, every bruise from training became proof that he was being forged not as a prince, but as a figure the world would remember. Already those around him whispered of a strange fire in his eyes, a gaze that seemed too sharp for a child. Even in these early years, Alexander revealed a hunger for learning that astonished his tutors. He listened to tales of Troy as if they were memories, idolizing Achilles and carrying with him a copy of Homer's Iliad wherever he went. Unlike many princes who drowned in luxury, Alexander embraced discipline, pushing himself harder than others. When he mastered the taming of the great horse Bucephalus, a beast that had terrified all who approached, his father declared with pride and foreboding that Macedonia was too small for his son's destiny. This single moment announced to the court that Alexander was destined not just to inherit, but to surpass. But privilege did not shield him from the dark storms of palace life. His father's affairs, his mother's jealousies, and constant threats of assassins made the palace a place of danger. Banquets could erupt in violence, and whispered conspiracies twisted through the air like smoke. For Alexander, every glance carried meaning, every silence could be betrayal. The boy learned early to calculate, to weigh loyalty against ambition, and to see in every ally the shadow of a rival. This sharpened his instincts, moulding him into a creature of both charisma and suspicion, traits that would define his rule. What haunted him most was his relationship with his father. Philip was a king of war, brilliant in strategy but cold, sometimes cruel, always measuring Alexander against his own towering legacy. Alexander longed for recognition, yet resented being treated as just another successor. Olympius fed his frustrations, whispering that Philip was mortal but Alexander was divine. The tension tore through his youth like a sword, making him desperate not only to prove himself, but to outshine the man whose shadow loomed over every triumph. In Alexander's heart, the seeds of ambition were watered by love, rivalry, and silent fury. And so, Alexander's childhood ended not in innocence, but in preparation. He emerged from the palace not as a boy, but as a weapon sharpened by circumstance. Trained in war, hardened by palace intrigues, and inflamed by stories of gods and heroes, he was ready to step into a world where power was the only measure of worth. Already, he bore the scars of ambition and the hunger for immortal glory. The child who once listened to epic tales by lamplight was now shaping his own story, one that would soon thunder across continents and leave behind a trail of fire, blood, and legend. At 13, Alexander's world shifted when his father summoned one of the greatest minds in history to guide his son, Aristotle. The philosopher was not merely a teacher, he was a sculptor of thought, shaping the boy's restless energy into sharp intellect. Under his care, Alexander studied philosophy, ethics, science, and the mysteries of nature. But what gripped him most were the lessons of Homer, tales of heroes who carved their names into eternity with sword and fire. Aristotle planted in him not only knowledge, but the conviction that his destiny was to surpass myth itself. Education for Alexander was no gentle pursuit. He devoured texts, argued fiercely with his master, and demanded answers that even Aristotle sometimes hesitated to give. He studied medicine so he could heal his soldiers, dissected animals to understand life itself, and explored geography to chart lands not yet conquered. His hunger for knowledge was as boundless as his hunger for power. Unlike other princes who treated studies as a duty, Alexander approached them as weapons, tools that would one day bend kingdoms to his will. Even as a boy, he carried himself like a man chosen to rewrite history. The influence of Aristotle did not end with books. He taught Alexander to see the world in terms of causes and effects, to understand not only men but their motives, their fears, and their weaknesses. This sharpened the young prince's natural instinct for leadership. He could look into the eyes of a companion and sense loyalty or betrayal. He could study a rival and already know where to strike. This gift, forged through philosophy and observation, would become as deadly to his enemies as any sword. Aristotle had given him more than knowledge. He had given him insight into the human soul. Yet Alexander was no cloistered student lost in scrolls. He trained daily in the arts of war, riding, swordsmanship, and hunting. His education was split between mind and body, and he excelled at both. While his peers struggled with military drills, Alexander embraced them with a ferocity that startled even seasoned commanders. He dreamed of uniting wisdom with war, of being not merely a warrior king, but a philosopher-conqueror, a figure who embodied both strength and intellect. This duality made him unlike any ruler the world had ever seen. But education also deepened his ambition and his restlessness. The more he learned of the vastness of the world, the more he burned to see it conquered. Tales of distant Persia, of India's mysteries, and of lands beyond the horizon set his blood on fire. While others were content with Macedonia's rising power, Alexander already dreamed of empire stretching across the earth. For him, study was never an end, it was preparation. Every lesson from Aristotle, every page of Homer, every map unfurled before his eyes was another step toward a destiny that no mortal crown could contain. His education was not confined to philosophy and science alone. Alexander absorbed the art of rhetoric, learning to move men with words as much as with weapons. He practiced speeches with fire in his voice, his presence commanding even in youth. When he spoke of Achilles or Heracles, it was as if he summoned the spirits of heroes themselves. Companions who listened felt drawn into his vision, ready to follow him to the edge of the world. This mastery of speech would one day rally armies across deserts, inspire loyalty against impossible odds, and silence dissent with nothing more than his commanding tone. Among his studies, Alexander's fascination with Homer became an obsession. The Iliad was not simply literature, it was his Bible, his manual for glory. He slept with a copy beneath his pillow, marked with Aristotle's notes, as though it were both shield and prophecy. He did not merely admire Achilles, he sought to live as him, to embody his rage, his passion, and his eternal fame. Where others saw myth, Alexander saw instruction. This obsession created in him a relentless drive to conquer, to endure, to carve his name into eternity alongside gods and legends. But alongside brilliance came a storm of pride and temper. Alexander's education taught him logic, yet his spirit often burned hotter than reason could control. He challenged tutors, questioned traditions, and grew impatient with those who lagged behind. This fiery nature made him both admired and feared among companions. He was not satisfied with being merely skilled. He demanded perfection of himself and expected the same of others. Those who failed him felt the sting of his sharp tongue or the colder punishment of his silence. In youth, his flaws were already clear, yet they only added to his aura of inevitability. Alexander's circle of companions also formed during these years, sons of Macedonian nobles who would later become his generals and rivals. With them, he hunted, trained, and debated, forging bonds that mixed loyalty with competition. These friendships were a crucible, sharpening him through rivalry and camaraderie alike. Among them, he practiced command, learning when to inspire, when to intimidate, and when to break pride to gain obedience. To them, he was more than a prince. He was already their leader, one they followed with awe and unease. The boy in Aristotle's school was already casting the shadow of a king. Yet even as knowledge and power grew within him, Alexander's education sowed seeds of doubt. For all the divine whispers of his mother and the glory-filled visions of Homer, Aristotle reminded him of human limits, of mortality, of the fragile line between man and God. Alexander wrestled with these contradictions in silence. Was he a mortal prince bound by fate, or was he destined to stand among the gods? The tension fueled his hunger for conquest, for only by surpassing every man and nation could he prove himself immortal. His education ended not with answers, but with an unquenchable fire that would consume the world. As Alexander stepped into his teenage years, the weight of destiny grew heavier on his shoulders. He was no longer merely the bright student of Aristotle or the Prince of Macedonia. He was a young man burning with ambition. His restless energy made him impatient with courtly life. While other youths enjoyed feasts and leisure, Alexander sought the thrill of the hunt, the rigor of combat, and the fire of debate. He wanted not only to prove himself, but to be tested against challenges worthy of a future conqueror. Even then, those who watched him knew they were witnessing the shaping of a force that could not be contained. His father's shadow, however, loomed constantly. Philip II was reshaping Macedonia into a war machine, conquering neighbours and turning the kingdom into Greece's rising power. For Alexander, admiration of his father clashed with resentment. He honoured Philip's victories but hated being dismissed as too young to command. When Philip paraded his successes, Alexander vowed in silence that one day he would surpass them. Their relationship was a furnace of rivalry and pride, love and hostility mixed into every glance. Olympias fed this fire, whispering that her son was destined for a throne not just of Macedonia, but of the entire world. As court intrigues deepened, Alexander learned the art of survival. He observed betrayal at banquets, daggers hidden behind smiles, and whispers that could topple kings. These lessons hardened his instincts, teaching him to trust few and watch all. By 15, he could already maneuver politically, countering rivals' schemes with wit and precision. When others saw a reckless youth, they overlooked the calculating mind behind the bright eyes. This blend of fire and strategy became his defining character. A dreamer who craved glory, but also a tactician who planned for betrayal before it struck. His first real test of responsibility came at 16, when Philip was away at war. Left in charge of Macedonia, Alexander faced a rebellion that could have shaken the kingdom. Instead of faltering, he raised an army, crushed the insurgents, and established a new city, Alexandropolis, in his own name. It was a declaration to the world. The boy was not merely a prince, he was already a ruler in action. The speed and ruthlessness of his decision-making stunned the court and sent whispers through Greece. Alexander had tasted power, and he would never let it slip from his grasp again. In battle and in politics, Alexander's courage bordered on recklessness. He led charges where princes were expected to observe, fought beasts others feared, and argued fiercely with men twice his age. But this boldness earned him respect among soldiers and companions. They saw not just a royal heir, but a warrior who bled and risked as they did. This bond with his men, forged in youth, became one of his greatest weapons. Yet beneath the bravado lingered his deeper fear, that he would never escape Philip's shadow unless he seized a destiny larger than Macedonia itself. Alexander's youth was also defined by his devotion to the heroic code. Achilles remained his guiding star, and he modelled himself on the warrior who chose short-lived glory over long life. This obsession shaped every decision. Glory mattered more than safety, and eternal fame more than comfort. He would rather risk death than fade into obscurity. This belief, instilled in youth, made him fearless on the battlefield, but also reckless in life. His companions often marvelled at how he seemed to court danger, as though only mortal peril could prove his immortality. But behind this heroic mask lay a boy with deep insecurities. He feared being dismissed as merely Philip's son, feared being forgotten if he failed to achieve greatness. Olympias's whispers about his divine blood both strengthened and haunted him. Was he truly born of Zeus, or was it a lie she told to fuel his ambition? These questions gnawed at him in silence. His solution was to act, to conquer, to prove through deeds that no mortal could rival him. In this inner turmoil, his character hardened into the paradox he would always carry: confidence that shook empires, yet insecurity that drove him endlessly forward. His relationships in youth were intense, charged with both loyalty and rivalry. Companions such as Hephaestion became not just friends but extensions of his soul, sharing in his dreams of conquest and glory. With others, competition burned hot, creating both trust and jealousy. Every bond was tested in hunting fields, in training grounds, and in debates. For Alexander, loyalty was sacred but fragile. He demanded absolute devotion and gave the same in return. These early friendships and rivalries became the backbone of his future army, binding his companions to him with ties forged in youth and tested in blood. The influence of his father remained impossible to escape. Philip's victories across Greece expanded Macedonia's power, but with each triumph, Alexander's resentment grew. He could not bear being overshadowed, could not endure watching his father bask in the glory he craved. At feasts, when Philip's generals praised him, Alexander's pride flared into rage. At times, he publicly defied his father, driven by the unshakable conviction that his own destiny was greater. These clashes foreshadowed the storm to come, for Alexander was not made to follow. He was made to rule, and only the throne could satisfy his hunger. By the end of his teenage years, Alexander was no longer simply a prince in waiting. He had commanded troops, founded cities, crushed rebellions, and stood as both warrior and politician. The boy shaped by Aristotle's wisdom, Olympias's ambition, and Philip's rivalry had become a figure of fear and admiration. Every scar, every triumph, every confrontation had forged a character at once magnetic and dangerous. He was a youth who embodied contradictions: scholar and warrior, dreamer and schemer, fiercely loyal, yet quick to betray if betrayed. The formation of his character was complete. The world was now a stage awaiting his first true act of conquest. Alexander entered adulthood already carrying the weight of a kingdom and the fire of ambition. At 18, he was recognized not only as Philip's heir, but as a formidable presence among Macedonia's elite. His charisma commanded attention, his tactical brilliance earned respect, and his confidence intimidated rivals. The court whispered constantly, this young man would either unite the known world or burn it to ashes in pursuit of glory. He moved through halls of power like a predator, simultaneously learning diplomacy, testing loyalty, and assessing weaknesses in both friend and foe. Marriage was as much a political maneuver as a personal union. Alexander's betrothal to Roxana, a Sogdian princess, was strategic, securing the loyalty of conquered territories and symbolizing the fusion of Greek and Eastern influence. The wedding was both a celebration and a declaration of intent. Alexander would not merely inherit Macedonia, he would extend his dominion across lands yet unconquered. In Roxana, he found both a companion and a symbol of his expanding empire. Their bond, passionate yet politically charged, became an axis around which his personal and political life would revolve. Children brought a glimpse of domesticity into Alexander's relentless life, yet family could not quell the storm within him. Even in the quiet of his palace, he schemed and planned, mapping campaigns that would span continents. His household became a microcosm of his ambitions. Servants, generals, and companions all tested for loyalty, every conversation measured for allegiance. While he loved his family, his ultimate devotion was to the empire he envisioned. Personal happiness was always secondary to power, though moments of tenderness revealed a man capable of deep attachment, if only fleetingly. Alexander's early adulthood also marked his first serious steps into governance. While Philip's reigned, Alexander was entrusted with command over regions and military units. He enforced laws with a mix of fairness and ruthless efficiency, demonstrating early the paradox that would define his rule: justice tempered by terror. Cities flourished under his oversight, yet whispers of harsh punishments and swift executions ensured that loyalty was maintained not by love alone, but by fear. His decisiveness in these formative years set the tone for his later empire-wide authority. Political cunning and battlefield instinct combined to shape Alexander's early adult identity. He observed his father, learned to negotiate alliances, and simultaneously plotted his eventual ascent. Every marriage, every command, every encounter was a chess move. He gained a reputation not only for brilliance but for unpredictability. Allies revered him, enemies feared him, and those who misjudged him discovered too late that the young prince had already calculated their downfall. This early adulthood forged the foundation of a leader who would conquer continents and rewrite the map of the ancient world. Alexander's ambitions could not be confined to the borders of Macedonia. He began demonstrating extraordinary military skill in campaigns against rebellious Greek city-states, showing a combination of daring strategy and audacious risk. Each victory was both a statement and a rehearsal for greater conquests. His ability to inspire men, to lead from the front, and to share in their hardships forged bonds of loyalty that no wealth or threat could break. Alexander's reputation as both fearless warrior and shrewd tactician spread like wildfire across Greece, earning both admiration and envy. As he matured, Alexander's household reflected the complexity of his life. Hephaestion, his lifelong companion, shared in both personal and military spheres, a bond that combined friendship, loyalty, and strategic collaboration. Roxana's presence brought moments of intimacy, yet Alexander never allowed domesticity to cloud his focus. The Macedonian court remained a stage of constant maneuvering, intrigue, and testing of loyalties. Every advisor, soldier, and nobleman was a player in a high-stakes game he orchestrated, ensuring that only the truly faithful advanced while dissenters were crushed swiftly. Alexander's marriage and family obligations also carried political weight in newly conquered territories. By uniting Greek and Eastern customs through his union with Roxana, he subtly prepared the foundation for cultural integration, blending diplomacy with authority. While domestic scenes might have suggested tranquility, Alexander's mind never rested. He plotted campaigns, studied enemy territories, and considered alliances that would stretch from Greece to the Indus Valley. His domestic life became inseparable from his imperial ambition, a crucible forging a ruler prepared to dominate the known world. Even in early adulthood, Alexander faced tests of loyalty and authority. Rebellio. Men's erupted in regions under his control, and he dealt with insurgencies decisively, often using brutal measures that would become characteristic of his reign. Cities that resisted were punished, populations relocated, and leaders executed, sending a clear message that defiance would be met with uncompromising force. Alexander's willingness to enforce harsh justice early demonstrated that mercy was a strategic choice, not a default. His reputation as both visionary and tyrant began to solidify in these formative campaigns. By the conclusion of this period, Alexander had become more than a prince. He was a storm gathering strength, blending education, ambition, and lethal strategy into a force poised to reshape the world. He had learned the arts of war, diplomacy, and governance simultaneously, and had begun cultivating a loyal cadre of generals and companions who would follow him to the ends of the earth. His early adulthood crystallized his identity, fearless, brilliant, commanding, and endlessly hungry for conquest. Nothing less than absolute glory would ever satisfy him. The death of Philip II was sudden, shocking, and violent, leaving Macedonia teetering on the edge of chaos. Alexander, only 20 years old, moved with ruthless precision to secure his succession. In the halls of Pella, whispers of rebellion and opportunistic rivals swirled like a storm, yet Alexander's presence quelled fear. He seized the throne not as a passive heir, but as a predator asserting dominance, making clear that the empire would follow his vision or be crushed. The young king's first acts were both pragmatic and brutal, ensuring loyalty through both charm and terror. Coronation ceremonies radiated power and divine authority. Alexander was hailed as the legitimate ruler, but he understood that perception alone could not sustain a kingdom hungry for security and conquest. Advisors, generals, and nobles watched him closely, testing his resolve. Yet Alexander's charisma and strategic mind left no doubt. He was no longer a prince, he was the absolute sovereign. Court politics shifted overnight, alliances forged and broken as he consolidated power, turning the Macedonian court into a reflection of his own ambitions, calculated, relentless, and utterly controlled. Internal fears and doubts haunted him, yet Alexander masked them behind a veneer of certainty. Each decision was a careful dance between authority and overreach. Advisors who hesitated or questioned him were sidelined or removed. Alexander's ability to anticipate betrayal and act preemptively ensured that potential threats never gained momentum. The young king's early reign displayed a paradox, a mind capable of visionary strategy combined with an unflinching willingness to eliminate any obstacle. Macedonia became a kingdom simultaneously inspired and terrified by its ruler. Ambitions beyond Greece pulsed in Alexander's mind from the moment he ascended. He inherited not just a kingdom, but a legacy of war, diplomacy, and empire building left by Philip. Alexander studied maps, histories, and military doctrines, preparing for campaigns that would span continents. His court became a hub of planning and intrigue, a place where ideas of conquest and governance were debated relentlessly, yet always through the filter of Alexander's decisive authority. Every advisor understood that his word was law, and his vision for expansion left no room for hesitation. The early years of Alexander's reign were marked by both consolidation and preparation for the extraordinary campaigns ahead. Cities were secured, fortifications strengthened, and armies tested in skirmishes that served as both training and warning. Macedonia's citizens and soldiers alike understood that the young king would brook no failure. Every move, whether in court or on the battlefield, reflected his unwavering commitment to absolute power. Alexander's ascension was not just a transfer of title, it was the birth of a ruler who would forever alter the map of the ancient world. Alexander's first major military expeditions as king demonstrated both brilliance and audacity. He led his forces into Thrace and Illyria, quelling rebellions with precision and ferocity. His ability to move rapidly, anticipate enemy strategies, and exploit weaknesses marked him as a tactical genius. Soldiers, inspired by his personal courage and unyielding discipline, followed him into battles that seemed impossible, turning potential disasters into legendary victories. Each conquest strengthened his authority and sent a clear message. Defiance of Alexander would be met with overwhelming force. In securing his throne, Alexander faced conspiracies that threatened to destabilize Macedonia. Some nobles, loyal to Philip's memory, sought to undermine the young king. Alexander responded with calculated ruthlessness. Plots were exposed, traitors punished, and loyalty enforced. Fear and respect became tools in his arsenal, shaping a court that mirrored his strategic mind. His rise was not just about military skill, but the mastery of political theatre, ensuring that his image as an invincible ruler overshadowed any whispers of weakness or doubt. The Macedonian army, a force moulded under Philip, now became Alexander's instrument of ambition. He innovated tactics, reorganized units, and demanded unparalleled discipline. Officers who faltered were replaced or disciplined publicly, reinforcing the standard of excellence. Alexander led by example, sharing hardships, marching at the front lines, and risking his life in ways that inspired unwavering loyalty. Soldiers began to view him not only as king, but as a force of destiny, a commander whose presence alone could tip the scales of war. Alexander's early foreign policy combined diplomacy with intimidation. Greek city-states, wary of Macedonian dominance, faced a choice: alliance or annihilation. Through a mix of negotiations, strategic marriages, and shows of military might, Alexander expanded his influence without waiting for provocation. Those who resisted, however, met swift and merciless retribution. Cities that had once defied Philip now recognized the young king's unmatched authority. Alexander's combination of charm, intelligence, and brutal enforcement made him both respected and feared across the Greek world. By the end of his initial years on the throne, Alexander had transformed Macedonia into a kingdom ready to unleash conquest on an unprecedented scale. His consolidation of power, mastery over generals and advisors, and early campaigns forged a foundation for the empire that would stretch from Greece to the edges of Persia. Every city subdued, every alliance secured, and every victory achieved was a step toward the vision that burned in Alexander's mind. An empire unchallenged, ruled by a king whose ambition knew no limits. From the moment Alexander assumed the throne, the drumbeats of war echoed across Macedonia. He did not wait for enemies to gather. He struck preemptively, demonstrating a ruthlessness that would define his legacy. Early campaigns in Thrace and Illyria were more than conquests. They were declarations of his unstoppable ambition. His army moved with unprecedented speed, capturing fortified cities before adversaries could organize resistance. Rivers ran red, not only from battle but from the fear that Alexander instilled in every opponent. His strategy combined genius with bold improvisation. Alexander studied enemy formations, exploiting terrain and morale with precision. Cavalry charges shattered lines, phalanx formations advanced like living walls, and siege engines toppled once impenetrable defenses. Generals, awed by his decisiveness, executed orders without question, knowing hesitation could mean death. Even in the heat of combat, Alexander remained fully aware of every flank, every weakness, turning chaotic battlefields into controlled symphonies of destruction. The young king's campaigns extended beyond Macedonia. Greek city-states that had resisted his father were brought into line, either by diplomacy or annihilation. Cities that resisted faced public massacres, while those that submitted were granted relative autonomy in exchange for loyalty. Alexander's combination of terror and calculated clemency solidified his reputation. Citizens and soldiers alike realized that resistance was futile, obedience rewarded, and betrayal punished with a cold efficiency that became his signature. Every victory expanded his resources, giving Alexander access to larger armies, siege technologies, and vast wealth. He trained his soldiers relentlessly, forging them into a cohesive, disciplined force capable of surviving brutal campaigns. Each conquest also served as a psychologizing weapon. News of his victories spread faster than armies could march, leaving enemies demoralized even before battle began. Alexander's empire grew not only through land taken, but through the fear he cultivated. The battles were personal as much as they were strategic. Alexander fought at the forefront, his presence a constant challenge to his enemies. He inspired loyalty and awe, but also envy and fear among his own ranks. Rival generals, impressed but wary of his ambition, watched his every move. Yet Alexander's charisma and unparalleled skill ensured that disloyalty rarely surfaced. His early military campaigns laid the foundation for an empire forged in blood, strategy, and the inexorable will of a young king determined to conquer the known world. Alexander's campaigns soon turned eastward as Persia became the ultimate prize. Crossing the Hellespont with a meticulously organized army, he advanced with relentless speed, striking cities that were thought impregnable. Each siege was executed with a combination of engineering brilliance and psychological warfare. Walls that had stood for centuries crumbled, and defenders were left trembling at the sheer audacity of his attacks. Macedonian soldiers witnessed their king's genius firsthand, as rivers of blood marked both victory and warning. Persian satraps underestimated Alexander, believing his youth would limit him. That miscalculation proved fatal. At the Battle of Granicus, he shattered a Persian cavalry force despite fierce resistance. His tactical flexibility allowed him to exploit terrain and enemy errors, turning apparent disadvantages into decisive triumphs. Soldiers who survived these battles emerged hardened, their faith in Alexander cemented, as they realized that failure was not an option, and that victory was only possible under his command. As the campaign progressed, Alexander's reputation grew into legend. Cities surrendered before a single arrow was fired, preferring submission to massacre. But those who resisted faced merciless destruction. Men, women, and children slaughtered, monuments razed. His strategy combined terror and spectacle. Every act of brutality served a purpose, ensuring that the Macedonian advance met less resistance and that the psychological impact of his conquests echoed far beyond the battlefield. Alexander's relationship with his generals evolved under the pressures of war. Trusted commanders were empowered to lead divisions, yet Alexander retained ultimate control, supervising every maneuver. Betrayal or failure was met with immediate and harsh consequences. This balance of fear and loyalty created an army that was nearly unstoppable. Each soldier, aware of both the rewards and the risks, committed fully to Alexander's vision of conquest, knowing that their survival and glory were inseparable from his ambition. By the time he reached Asia Minor, Alexander's campaigns had transformed him from a Macedonian king into a near-mythical figure. His combination of speed, strategy, charisma, and brutality ensured that every enemy feared him, every ally revered him, and every battle reinforced his growing empire. The foundations of an unprecedented dominion were being laid, stretching from Greece across the Persian heartlands, driven by a man whose ambition eclipsed that of any mortal before him. Alexander inherited a kingdom still reeling from his father's campaigns, a tapestry of alliances, resentments, and fragile loyalty. He quickly realized that military conquest alone could not secure his empire. Macedonian cities required careful oversight, and Greek states demanded subtle diplomacy. Alexander's genius lay not only in battle, but in governance, balancing force and persuasion, cruelty and reward, in ways that left subjects obedient yet wary. He implemented laws that reinforced his authority, often blending Macedonian tradition with local customs. Governors were appointed with strict oversight, rebellions crushed swiftly, and traitors punished publicly to instill fear. Yet, Alexander also granted autonomy to compliant regions, cultivating loyalty through calculated clemency. His reputation as both ruthless and just kept citizens, satraps, and soldiers alike aligned under his rule, wary of overstepping but motivated by potential reward. Economically, Alexander understood that an empire could only thrive if its wealth was harnessed efficiently. He secured tribute from conquered territories, reorganized trade routes, and ensured that resources flowed to Macedonia and his advancing armies. Wealth was spent strategically. Infrastructure projects, military campaigns, and city building cemented loyalty and demonstrated power. His policies were pragmatic, combining short-term gain with long-term stability, ensuring that conquered lands were productive rather than empty shells. Alexander's political acumen also extended to handling opposition within his court. Advisors and generals were watched carefully, their loyalty tested through both rewards and fear. Plots were uncovered quickly, often resulting in execution or exile. Yet Alexander's charm and charisma tempered his harshness, creating a court that revered him while quietly trembling at his unpredictable wrath. His ability to balance loyalty and intimidation kept potential conspirators in check and strengthened his control over the sprawling empire. Religion and culture became tools of governance. Alexander adopted local customs where convenient, blending Greek and Persian traditions to reinforce his authority. By presenting himself as a divine or semi-divine figure in conquered regions, he reduced resistance and fostered unity. Temples, ceremonies, and public spectacles were strategically staged, signaling both respect for local traditions and the overarching supremacy of Alexander's rule. His empire was not merely military, it was political, economic, and cultural, carefully engineered to withstand internal and external pressures. He turned his attention to the integration of conquered peoples, encouraging intermarriage between Macedonians and Persians, binding elites through family ties. These unions were political weapons as much as social experiments, designed to merge cultures and secure loyalty. Alexander personally participated in some ceremonies, signaling his commitment to unity, yet dissenters were swiftly silenced, often through public punishments that demonstrated the peril of defiance. Administrative centres were fortified with Macedonian garrisons, ensuring compliance while fostering local governance. Tax collection was rigorous but not arbitrary, designed to fund campaigns and infrastructure while avoiding widespread rebellion. Alexander's policies balanced extraction with incentives, rewarding cooperation with privileges and wealth, punishing resistance with devastating efficiency. Each decree reinforced his vision of a tightly controlled yet expansive empire. Trade and commerce flourished under his supervision. Cities along the Persian corridor and beyond were revitalized as hubs for goods, artisans, and mercenaries. Roads were repaired, ports expanded, and markets standardized, creating a network that supplied both armies and civilians. The wealth generated strengthened Alexander's grip, feeding both his ambition and the loyalty of those who benefited from his system, making rebellion costly and impractical. Alexander's handling of regional unrest showcased his blend of diplomacy and terror. Rebellions in Babylon and other cities were crushed swiftly, yet he sometimes spared key figures willing to pledge allegiance, using them as intermediaries. His strategy of selective clemency contrasted sharply with brutal retaliation, cultivating a reputation that both intimidated enemies and encouraged submission, forcing rulers to weigh resistance against the certainty of swift and miraculous consequences. The emperor's vision extended beyond the battlefield and treasury. Education, architecture, and cultural patronage were deployed as tools of control and inspiration. Cities were founded in his name, statues erected, and Hellenic learning promoted. This projection of power created a sense of inevitability around his rule. Alexander's empire was not only unstoppable militarily, but ingrained into the fabric of conquered lands. His combination of military might, political cunning, and cultural strategy forged an empire that commanded obedience and awe alike. Alexander's life off the battlefield was a complex dance of luxury, indulgence, and fear. He dined on exotic delicacies from across his empire, feasted in palaces adorned with gold, ivory, and tapestries depicting his victories, yet his nights were often restless, haunted by visions of betrayal and death. His personal habits were a blend of Spartan rigor and decadent excess, a reflection of a mind always at war, both with enemies and his own ambitions. He maintained a tight inner circle of companions, generals, and close advisors, yet even there suspicion simmered. Trust was measured, loyalty tested, and friendships were often transactional, dictated by power rather than affection. His domestic life was punctuated by lavish ceremonies, yet private moments were rare, and paranoia cast a shadow over family interactions. Every gesture, every word, could be weighed as a test of allegiance. Alexander's marriage to Roxana was politically charged, intended to solidify alliances in Bactria, yet passion and genuine connection intermingled with strategic calculation. Their union produced a son, Alexander IV, but domestic life offered little refuge. The pressures of empire and endless campaigns meant that even family time was punctuated by the looming spectre of war and governance, leaving personal relationships tense and precarious. Tyranny became Alexander's tool as much as his sword. His punishments were severe, public, and theatrical. Traitors executed, conspirators mutilated, dissenters humiliated. Yet this cruelty was tempered by occasional mercy, creating a psychological equilibrium that kept subjects fearful but obedient. Alexander understood that power was not only wielded through force, but perceived omnipotence, and he cultivated an aura that kept both enemies and allies in awe. Court life was a theatre of intrigue. Banquets, hunts, and festivals masked the constant undercurrent of plotting. Alexander's presence dominated every gathering. Silence and subtle gestures were scrutinized for meaning. Even his companions, those who had fought beside him through blood and fire, knew that a misplaced word or perceived disloyalty could lead to exile or death. In this cauldron of opulence and paranoia, Alexander ruled with an intensity that left no one untouched, shaping both loyalty and fear in equal measure. Alexander's personal fears extended beyond betrayal. He was haunted by mortality and the fragility of his empire. Nights often found him restless, contemplating the vast lands he had conquered and the tenuous threads holding them together. Dreams of glory intermingled with visions of collapse, fueling both his ambition and his tyranny as he sought to control every aspect of his domain to stave off chaos and uncertainty. His relationships with other rulers were a mix of diplomacy and domination. He demanded homage, yet he occasionally demonstrated generosity to secure loyalty. Leaders who submitted were rewarded with status and wealth, while defiance was met with swift, devastating retribution. Alexander's dual approach of fear and favor reinforced his absolute authority, creating an empire held together by both reverence and terror. Luxury and ceremony masked the relentless demands of leadership. Palaces were resplendent, yet every day involved scrutiny of reports, counsel with generals, and planning of military and administrative campaigns. His diet and routines were regimented for stamina and health, yet moments of indulgence revealed the human side of a ruler otherwise seen as unstoppable. Even in opulence, the pressure to maintain control was relentless, leaving no room for respite. Scandals and court intrigue punctuated his reign. Rivalries among generals, jealousies over rewards, and accusations of disloyalty required constant vigilance. Alexander acted decisively, often with brutal efficiency, to suppress dissent and maintain the hierarchy. His handling of controversies demonstrated both strategic acumen and ruthless pragmatism, ensuring that the perception of his omnipotence remained intact. Despite the wealth and glory surrounding him, Alexander's life was defined by extremes. The same hands that orchestrated battles and city foundations could order executions and punishments. His personal and political lives were inseparable, each action a reflection of his drive for absolute control. In luxury and fear, in love and tyranny, Alexander the Great forged an existence that was both legendary and terrifying, leaving a legacy that would echo for millennia. Alexander faced foes whose skill and cunning matched his own, turning every campaign into a high-stakes test of strategy and courage. In the plains of Granicus, he cut through Persian forces with precision, yet the river of blood foreshadowed future trials. Each victory brought glory, but also fierce resistance, as local kings and satraps sought to resist his expanding empire with relentless zeal. At Issus, he confronted Darius III, Persia's formidable king. The battle raged like a storm, with cavalry charges, arrows, and swords clashing amid screams and chaos. Alexander's genius for positioning and timing turned near defeat into decisive triumph. Yet even as Darius fled, the encounter exposed vulnerabilities. His army was stretched thin, reliant on speed, morale, and his unyielding charisma to hold together a vast coalition of troops. Sieges became both art and terror under Alexander. Tyre, a fortified island city, resisted for months, forcing him to innovate with causeways, towers, and relentless assaults. Lives were lost in staggering numbers, civilians starved, and the city eventually fell with gruesome punishment inflicted upon defenders. Each conquest left not only territory but scars etched into the land and memory, a testament to the merciless calculus of empire building. Alexander's enemies were not only foreign kings, even within his ranks rivals emerged. Discontented generals, jealous companions, and local leaders plotted in shadows. Betrayal sometimes struck at critical moments, demanding immediate action. His swift responses, ranging from strategic purges to calculated mercy, demonstrated a mind that balanced fear and respect to maintain cohesion amidst chaos. Despite brilliance, defeat touched Alexander. In battles against guerrilla fighters in India, his forces encountered unfamiliar terrain and tactics that strained supply lines and morale. These setbacks forced him to adapt, blending diplomacy with force, showing that even the greatest conqueror could meet resistance that tested endurance, resolve, and tactical ingenuity. The loss of men weighed heavily on Alexander. At the Hyphasis River, exhausted troops refused to march further into India, their rebellion forcing him to temper ambition with pragmatism. The tension between his insatiable drive for conquest and the human limits of his army created moments of frustration, negotiation, and calculated retreat, highlighting the delicate balance between leadership and overreach. Battles were not just physical, but psychological. Alexander's enemies exploited terrain, morale, and misinformation to challenge his supremacy. Yet his ability to read intentions, predict maneuvers, and inspire loyalty often turned potential disaster into tactical advantage. The interplay of cunning and courage in every encounter became his hallmark, earning both reverence and fear across continents. His most formidable adversaries, Darius III, Porus, and the rebellious satraps, tested every facet of his command. Each opponent demanded innovation, from phalanx coordination to cavalry flanking, from siegecraft to psychological warfare. Alexander's response was always direct and bold, demonstrating a mastery that blurred the line between genius and obsession, genius and tyranny. Every battlefield carried its own horrors. Cities burned, rivers ran red with blood, and entire populations were uprooted or slaughtered. Alexander bore witness to human suffering as both consequence and tool, recognizing that terror and awe were inseparable in maintaining dominion. Yet he also displayed acts of mercy when politically advantageous, reinforcing his complex persona as both liberator and oppressor. In the aftermath of wars, Alexander's triumphs reshaped regions. Territories were annexed, garrisons established, and alliances forged through marriages or political appointments. Yet even as he celebrated victories, he understood that each conquest sowed seeds of future resistance. His empire expanded rapidly, but the burden of control, the ever-present threat of betrayal, and the scars of combat were a constant reminder that no victory was absolute. The weight of conquest began to gnaw at Alexander's mind. Endless campaigns, relentless battles, and constant vigilance against betrayal eroded his mental stability. Nights were haunted by paranoia. Friends and generals were scrutinized for disloyalty, and even whispers could spark deadly suspicion. The brilliance that had fueled victories now threatened to become a perilous obsession. As his army ventured further into unknown territories, exhaustion and dissent grew. Troops mutinied, frustrated by relentless marches and foreign lands. Alexander's unyielding ambition clashed with human limits, forcing him to negotiate, cajole, and sometimes punish in ways that reflected both genius and mounting instability. His authority, once absolute, faced cracks that required constant reinforcement. Political rebellions simmered throughout the empire. Governors, satraps, and local rulers challenged his decrees, exploiting distance and communication delays. Alexander's responses were swift, blending fear, diplomacy, and cunning military interventions. Yet each rebellion, even when crushed, gnawed at his sense of omnipotence, fueling sleepless nights and moments of irrational anger. Court intrigues intensified. Close companions, once loyal friends, were suspected of plotting against him. Accusations, forced confessions, and executions became tools to enforce obedience. The lines between reality and paranoia blurred. Allies grew cautious, fear became pervasive, and trust, a cornerstone of his previous success, eroded under the weight of suspicion and relentless pressure. Amid the chaos, external threats loomed. Distant territories resisted, neighboring kingdoms prepared retaliatory campaigns, and unruly populations threatened stability. The empire's vastness, once a symbol of glory, became a liability. Alexander's mind, consumed by the impossible task of total control, oscillated between brilliance and instability, a ruler whose genius was shadowed by the mounting costs of his unrelenting drive. Exhaustion and illness began to gnaw at Alexander's vitality. Endless campaigns in harsh climates, inadequate rest, and relentless stress left his body vulnerable. Fever, fatigue, and physical injuries compounded his mental strain, feeding paranoia and intensifying his volatile temperament. His once unshakable presence now bore cracks, visible even to his closest companions. The pressure of leadership magnified his inner demons. Every decision carried consequences for thousands of lives, every failure a potential spark for rebellion. Alexander's reactions became increasingly unpredictable. Moments of brilliance alternated with fits of rage, harsh punishments, and impulsive commands, signaling the slow unraveling of a mind burdened by omnipotence. Rebellions and unrest erupted in conquered territories. Cities resisted tribute, governors defied orders, and regional alliances threatened fragmentation. Alexander's strategy combined force and intimidation with diplomacy, yet the empire's sheer size made consistent enforcement impossible. Each suppressed revolt was a temporary solution, a reminder that control was never complete. Within his inner circle, tensions reached breaking points. Generals, advisors, and friends navigated treacherous waters of loyalty and fear. Accusations of betrayal, forced oaths, and violent confrontations became common. Alexander's distrust poisoned relationships that had once been sources of support, isolating him in a court increasingly defined by suspicion and coercion rather than camaraderie. Despite the turmoil, Alexander's ambition did not waver. Dreams of further conquest and ultimate dominion over the known world drove him onward, even as physical and mental limits pressed relentlessly. His genius persisted amid the chaos, but the cost was evident, an empire straining at its seams, a ruler haunted by his own creations, and a legacy teetering between glory and tragedy. Alexander fell gravely ill in Babylon after a relentless campaign across harsh lands, battling both exhaustion and the onset of fever. His body, weakened by wounds, relentless marching, and heavy drinking, succumbed to an undiagnosed illness, possibly typhoid or malaria. Physicians could only watch as his once invincible frame weakened day by day, his breathing shallow, pulse fading. In his final days, Alexander exhibited the same imperious will that had defined his life. He summoned generals, whispered commands, and debated succession despite his fading strength. Even in decline, he sought to shape the fate of his empire, making final declarations about territories, heirs, and the loyalty of his closest companions, leaving a tense, unresolved power dynamic in the air. Family and companions gathered at his bedside. Mourning mingled with fear, as rivals calculated advantage and allies wept silently. His mother, Olympias, grieved with a mixture of sorrow and concern for the empire's future, while his generals faced the terrifying uncertainty of leadership succession, knowing that Alexander's absence would unleash forces beyond their control. The empire itself trembled. Regions loyal under fear and admiration now sensed vulnerability. Satraps, governors, and distant cities contemplated rebellion, armies questioned obedience, and political alliances shifted overnight. Alexander's death, though expected by some, struck with shocking immediacy, leaving a vacuum in the center of a vast, fragile empire built on relentless conquest. Public reaction was a mix of reverence, shock, and trepidation. Citizens who had once marveled at his victories mourned, while survivors of his campaigns remembered bloodshed, cruelty, and tyranny. The legacy of a young, brilliant, and ruthless conqueror now hung suspended between reverence and fear as the empire braced for the chaos that inevitably followed the death of its unstoppable leader. The body of Alexander was placed in a grand funeral procession adorned with gold, precious fabrics, and symbols of conquest. His generals and closest companions carried the weight of both grief and political maneuvering, knowing that every gesture was scrutinized for clues about succession. The streets of Babylon were lined with subjects witnessing the end of an era. Rival generals immediately began asserting influence over the young empire. Perdiccas, Antipater, and other key figures maneuvered for control, leveraging their positions to secure territories, troops, and allegiance. Alexander's intended succession plans were vague, and this ambiguity ignited a deadly contest of power among the most ambitious men of his court. Reports of his death spread quickly through the empire. Soldiers who had marched thousands of miles under his command faced disbelief, sorrow, and fear. Cities loyal to Alexander braced for unrest, while distant provinces seized the opportunity to renegotiate terms or rebel outright. The ripple effect of his passing destabilized an empire that had seemed unassailable. Within the royal family, Olympias acted decisively to protect her grandson, Alexander IV, the posthumous heir. Political machinations intensified, with threats to her influence from ambitious generals and court figures. The personal grief of the family intertwined with ruthless strategies, a reflection of the volatile world Alexander had forged and the precarious balance of power left behind. The immediate aftermath left a world in shock. Empires trembled at the absence of the young conqueror who had reshaped continents. The legacy of Alexander's life, his victories, brutality, ambition, and genius hung over every decision, every rebellion, and every alliance. The death of Alexander the Great marked not only the end of a life, but the fragile beginning of a tumultuous struggle for the future of the Greek Empire. Alexander's empire fragmented almost immediately after his death. His generals, later known as the Diadochi, carved territories, fought wars among themselves, and established dynasties across the known world. Macedonia, Greece, Egypt, Persia, and parts of India all faced competing claims. Yet Alexander's vision of a united empire remained an unreachable ideal, a shadow that guided and haunted his successors. Culturally, Alexander's campaigns spread Hellenistic influence far beyond Greece. Greek language, art, architecture, and philosophy merged with local traditions, creating a syncretic civilization that endured centuries. Cities like Alexandria became centers of knowledge, trade, and political power, embodying the fusion of East and West he had envisioned even as his empire politically fractured. His military genius became the benchmark for future conquerors. Tactics employed at Gaugamela, Issus, and across the Persian heartlands were studied and emulated by generals for millennia. His boldness, speed, and ability to inspire loyalty among diverse armies reshaped the art of war, influencing leaders from the Romans to Napoleon and beyond. Alexander's personal legend grew rapidly. Tales of his courage, ruthlessness, and charisma were retold, creating a figure larger than life. Scholars, poets, and historians immortalized his conquests, his flaws, and his ambition. The combination of myth and history made him a symbol of both ultimate power and tragic human vulnerability, cementing his enduring place in world consciousness. The psychological impact of Alexander's life on both contemporaries and successors was profound. Leaders and statesmen grappled with his legacy of ambition, tyranny, and genius, often comparing themselves or being measured against him. His life became a mirror, reflecting the possibilities and dangers of unchecked ambition and the costs of relentless conquest. Even as his empire dissolved politically, Alexander's reforms left lasting administrative and social structures. Local elites were incorporated into governing systems, trade routes were expanded, and cities founded under his name became hubs of commerce and culture. His vision of interconnected regions reshaped economic and political landscapes across 3 continents. Religiously and symbolically, Alexander's deification in some cultures reflected the awe he inspired. Temples and statues commemorated his victories, and rulers claimed divine favor by associating themselves with his image. His presence transcended mortality, blending historical fact with legend, reinforcing his role as both a conqueror and a near-mythical figure. In art, literature, and philosophy, Alexander's life inspired generations. Stories of his bravery, strategic brilliance, and complex character were depicted in mosaics, sculptures, and epic poems. His achievements became a standard of excellence and ambition, serving as a cautionary tale of the costs of unbridled power, the fragility of human life, and the fleeting nature of empires. The geopolitical map of the ancient world was irrevocably altered. Hellenistic kingdoms established by his successors dominated for centuries, influencing politics, trade, and culture from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. His campaigns created unprecedented cultural exchange, reshaping societies long after his death and ensuring his impact was both immediate and enduring. Ultimately, Alexander the Great's legacy was a paradox. Unparalleled conquest paired with political instability, visionary ambition shadowed by personal flaws, and eternal fame contrasted with mortal fragility. His life inspired awe, fear, and emulation, shaping the course of history in ways that resonate across millennia, leaving an indelible imprint on civilization itself.